Today we will be painting a Hot Wheel car, using manky brushes and doing something with whatever these are, as we check out verdigris and oil stains in the next installment of our Army Painter Fanatic Effects series. First off, let's check out the colours of the paint before we begin playing around with them. The verdigris is a nice bright teal colour, and this should be great when it's next to darker metallic colours. The oil stains paint feels a bit thicker and more gloopy. It's also got a nice glossy appearance. It feels like an actual engine oil. And lastly, I'm sure people would be thinking, I know I did, how this would compare to just using dark tone. And there is a difference, as the wash is not only a lot thinner and more runny, as you can see here, but it will dry matte compared to the glossy oil. And the verdigris has a nice subtle texture once it dries. So let's jump onto the oil first. I've got this Hot Wheel car which I have started to paint for the Gaslands game, and I wanted to add some oily residue and grease to the engine. This paint is semi-transparent, so you could slop it on quite thick if you wanted to, or paint it with a thinner layer such as these grimy streaks for example. This effects paint would be good for any mechanical areas on your models like pipes, exhausts, or a Necron snow cone. But what I wanted to try out was creating an oil pit. So I piled on a load of paint to see how it would fare on a larger surface area. I'm loving the colour and the glossy finish, but being just a paint, it will retract back and lose its volume. So let's sort that out. With magic beads! Well, not exactly with these beads, but they are transparent and I have cut them in half to make a dome shape and super glued them onto the base. To add some more volume to the oil paint, AK still water was used. The pair were then mixed together on a plastic artist palette. Careful not to go too vigorously to avoid trapping air and thus creating lots of bubbles. Now, due to the bottom of this base already been painted brown, the transparent beads will show the colour underneath, and you'll get this more oily, transparent bubble look. You could either keep this or just paint over the oil directly to cover this up more. Or if you have a larger piece of terrain, you could keep a bit of both and create a little bit more interest. Especially if you're making something like a tar pit. The base was put to one side and left to dry. In the meantime, I played around with the verdigris paint and I'll show you 3 different ways of using this paint. The first is to thin it down with some war paint stabilizer. I mean really thin it down, so that it looks like it starts to separate on the palette. And then let the capillary action do all the work for you. Just dot your brush onto the edges of the sculpt and the recesses and it will spread around naturally. I used a dry makeup brush afterwards to pick up any excess. And once dry, a slight grain of the paint will appear, giving you a speedy verdigris effect with little effort. Method 2 is to round up your best looking brushes because we're going to create a mottled, oxidized look. A rough iron and then weapon bronze was applied to this Mordor troll shield. It was built up by buffering on the paint in a wax on, wax off circular motion to create this dark metal look. Then I got my most worn out and splayed looking brush and patted on the verdigris paint to create an uneven and random splodgy look. My tip here is to not throw away all of your old brushes, as they still have a use. Lastly, the 2 previous paints were used again to dry brush onto the surface of the shield. This basically sandwiches this verdigris layer, giving us this patchy finish, where some verdigris is duller and more faint looking, and then there are some areas where it's a bit brighter. And whilst the previous verdigris from the Stormcast shield was still moist on the palette, I threw that onto some of the rivets and the edges of this sculpt to enhance this weathered look a bit further. Method number 3 is to go green. Verdigris was applied to the whole miniature, as I wanted this to be the undertone colour, as this miniature is going to be immortalised forever as a statue. Now remember, this paint does have a texture to it, so if you don't want that to show up in the final result, then use a similar coloured acrylic paint from your range, such as the army painter Amulet Aqua. What a nice sounding name. A makeup brush was used for the last two colours, as it's softer than a dry brush, and you can get to the deeper areas of the sculpt easier to pick them out. Like the troll shield previously, a dark metallic colour was used first. This time, death metal was used to cover most of the outer areas of the sculpted details on the miniature, leaving the verdigris in the recesses. Then a brighter copper colour was painted on the exact same way, however I tried to not cover all of the previous metal colour here, so there's still a bit of depth to our metals. Honestly, there are some pretty awesome new metallic colours in the Fnatic range, and you can come up with some good combinations. So now we have created a quick statue of our short, stubby warrior, Samantha. And back to our now fully dried, oily base. And I can see that the water has retracted a lot more than I had hoped for, so I added a second layer of it. And to be honest, I'm a touch annoyed with this AK still water product, as it loses a lot of volume after you've applied it. So you end up using multiple layers, and that's just time consuming. What water effects do you wonderful people use out there? Let me and others know in the comments, because it would be nice to try out different brands and products. And just because, I added some green vomit to the pool of oil, and gave it a tar pit / dank swampy feel to it. Overall, whilst creating these effects videos for you, my advice would be just to have a play with all of these wonderful paints. Create those really cool ideas that you have in your head. Or you can find some images online and see if you can create something similar for your own hobby. The main thing is to have some fun and get creative.